بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So today is lesson number 10, the 10th lesson in our series on Taqreeb Tadmuriyyah. And in the previous lesson or two, we concluded our discussion of the basic principles that we are operating upon as it relates to speaking about Allah, His names, His attributes, and we basically summarized those principles in 6 or 7 or so points. That was in the lesson prior to the previous lesson. And in the previous lesson, Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, in his summarization, he then went on to look at the groups who have deviated in the topic of Allah's attributes, and they can be divided into 2 groups. I actually had some handouts to give, so I'll just pass those through you. Actually, if you give me one, maybe one. Yes, there should be a handout with a diagram, and so basically this is just to give us an overview of what we have been discussing and what we are going to discuss in the lessons to come. So in the last lesson, as we said, the first of those groups who deviated, they are the mumathila, and they are the ones who liken Allah's attributes to those of the creation. And there's a particular argument that they use, and this argument, if you reflect upon it, is the same argument or the same mistake that is used by both those who liken Allah's attributes to those of the creation and those who negate Allah's attributes altogether or in part. Right? It's the same misconception in the middle that they are using for their particular deviation. Right? And what is that basic argument or misconception? It is, if you look at the bottom of the diagram, you'll see the 2 columns of writing on either side. If you look at the mumathila, what do the mumathila say? The mumathila, they say that we can only know the unseen realities through what we see in the world. So the only way Allah can have attributes if they are like ours. Thus, Allah has life like our life, hearing like our hearing, seeing like our seeing. Otherwise, Allah would not have attributes and be described with anything, and we would not know Him. So basically what they are saying is, the only way we can know of these attributes that we see, and that Allah speaks of in His book, such as life, and hearing, and seeing, and face, and all the other attributes, we only know these attributes having their realities based upon what we see and what we experience around us. And so for Allah to have attributes, for Allah to have actual attributes, then they have to be like and they have to resemble what we see. Right? So Allah must have hearing like our hearing, He must have seeing like our seeing, He must have life like our life, and so on and so forth. Right? So this is the argument of the mumathila. And as Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, he mentioned, this group has always been a minority, right? Because the misguidance in this is very clear and very apparent. Everybody knows this cannot be correct. This is misguidance. This is false. This is likening Allah with His creation, and that's why these people were very, very small in history. It was the Rafida, the Shia, who spoke with this particular doctrine in the 2nd century after Hijrah, but they didn't last very long, and the Shia actually became Mu'tazila, right? So they then went to the other side, on the other side of those, amongst those who deny and reject Allah's attributes, right? So the Mumathila, those who liken Allah's attributes to those of the creation. In the previous lesson, we looked at the refutation of this group, and this refutation is done, first of all, by the Quran, with the Quran, by the revealed texts. Secondly, it is done by way of reason. And thirdly, it is done just by way of basic observation. And so these three arguments, we went through them in the previous lesson. In the previous lesson, we said, why is this belief, why is it wrong? The first evidence is from Revelation. Allah clearly said, Laysa kamithlihi shay. There is nothing which is a likeness unto Him. There's nothing which is like Allah in His attributes, in His essence. This is very clear and very explicit. Then we also have the command of Allah, فَلَا تَضْرِبُوا لِلَّهِ الْأَمْثَالِ. فَلَا تَضْرِبُوا لِلَّهِ الْأَمْثَالِ. Do not set up likenesses for Allah. So this is a clear prohibition of setting up likenesses. Right? So these are clear texts in the Quran which prohibit us from saying that Allah is like His creation, or His attributes are like those of the creation, or that His hearing is like that of the creation. Right? We are expressly forbidden. Right? So that shows that this is prohibited, and this is incorrect. As for the argument of reason, there were three arguments that we went through. And the first argument is, if you recall previously, we spoke of the principle that similarity in name does not mean likeness in reality. Right? We went through that principle, and we gave many examples and illustrations to show how, for example, if you speak of the hearing or the seeing of a jinn, or the speech of a jinn, or the knowledge of a jinn, then there's no way that you can actually conceive of that in your mind. You can't fathom it or think of it or conceive of it, because you haven't seen the essence of the jinn in its natural form, and you can't. And so because of the difference in essences, you can't really conceive in your mind the reality of the hearing, the seeing, the speech, the life, and all the other things that jinn is described with. Right? So this clearly shows that the similarity in the name or the label does not necessitate the likeness in the reality. And this principle here is the key to understanding the mistake of the Mumathila and the Mu'attila, as we shall see. They are ignoring this important principle, which is proven in the Quran, and in fact it's proven in a single verse of the Quran. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. There is no likeness unto Allah, and He is the all-hearing and the all-seeing. Right? So negated any likeness, but affirmed hearing and seeing. Right? So the first of the three rational or intellectual arguments is that we know that there is that Allah is unique and distinct and different to His creation in His essence and in His attributes. Right? And this is what we explained. We said, look, we gave the example of the jinn and the human, and we compared the attributes. A jinn might have a hand you might have speech, might have hearing, but you cannot conceive in your mind. Yes, you might try to conceive, you might try to conceive of a jinn and his hand, maybe because you're trying to still use what you experience to try and think what the hand of a jinn might be like. But you still can't do it. You still can't do it because you don't know what the essence of the jinn is. And the same with all the other attributes. So because the essence, the that of the jinn is different to the that of the ins, to the human, right? Then the way that the attributes exist and are found with those essences is totally different, right? So if that is so between two created things, then how much more so does it apply between the created and the creator? Right, so this is the first rational argument to show that this doctrine is false. Right, the doctrine of the mumathila, who claim there has to be a likeness between Allah and His creation for us to understand that Allah has attributes. That's not true. That's not true. That this is expressly negated in the texts, and rationally this is one of three arguments. The second of three arguments is that if we were to accept this idea that Allah's attributes are like those of His creation, then we have belittled Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We belittled Him by making Him like or equal to His creation. Right? So this is a belittlement. It is tanaqqus of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because you cannot compare He who is complete, perfect, with that which is incomplete, deficient. This now means ascribing deficiency to Allah. The third argument that we looked at last week is also the very basis of us worshipping Allah and giving servitude to Allah is that Allah is Allahu Akbar, Allah is the greatest, Allah is Azim, He is mighty, Allah is unlike His creation, right? But if we were to now say that Allah resembles or is like His creatures in His names and His attributes, then Allah no longer has that unique, distinct perfection, completion, absence of deficiencies. We've now made Him just like the creation. So therefore now, the ubudiyyah, the worship of Allah, the very worship of Allah now is basically undermined and invalidated. So we invalidate the worship of Allah by likening Him to the creation. Just like, for example, what the Christians do with Isa alayhi salam. Obviously theirs is a very open, clear, apparent likeness. They say Isa is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or is the son of Allah, is Allah. Okay, so now you've just destroyed the whole basis of singling out Allah in worship and worshipping Allah. Why? Because now you've made Isa, along with his deficiencies as a man, needing food, needing drink, and all those other things, right? We've now invalidated the basis of worshipping Allah. So this is the third argument, that if this doctrine was correct of tamthil, then we would nullify the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these were the three rational arguments from reason, the three rational arguments from reason, and the third line of evidence. So we said there's evidence from revelation, evidence from reason, and thirdly, evidence just from pure observation. So this one is similar to what's preceded. We look around us and we see, as I mentioned to you before, the example that I gave, that you have wood and you have water, right? And the essences are different. But I can say that the wood has strength, has power. Right? There's a strength and there's a power in the wood. But the water also has a strength and a power, which is of a different type to the power that the wood has. Right? And in some respects, the power of the water is actually stronger, because if you put wood in water over time, the water will erode and dissolve and whatever. On the other hand, if you use, in other ways, the wood is stronger, but we can still apply the attribute of power. I can still say water has power, the wood has power, right? And the realities are unique to each thing. So when I say the power of water, you know that when I use the word power, it's actually distinct and uniquely applied to water, because water has an essence. And when I say the power of stone or rock or wood, you know that the power that I'm speaking of is unique to the thing that I'm attributing it to, right? So from this we know that when we ascribe attributes to a thing, then it becomes particular and specific to that thing, right? And this we know just by observation, just by looking around us and observing and experiencing things around us in nature, in Allah's creation. We can clearly see this. So in the same way, if this is permissible and is the case between created things, then it applies even more so between Allah and His creation. And it shows that there can be no likeness, right? So this is the third argument, and this is where we finished in the previous lesson. So this is really a recap up until this point of the previous lesson. So today's lesson number 10, we start at this point. And so then Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, after mentioning these 3 lines of evidence against tamthil and against the mumathila, he then goes back and he looks at their argument. What's the basic argument that they said? So he says, أما قولهم إن الله تعالى خاطبنا بما نعقل ونفهم فصحيح. Right? As for when these people, they say to us that Allah has addressed us, with the Quran, with the language and what He mentioned, with such things that we are able to grasp and understand. Right? Because this is the argument of the mumathila. What they are saying is, look, Allah has spoken to us in Arabic language, which we are able and supposed to understand. So when Allah says Allah has hearing, Allah has seeing, we can only understand it and grasp it by what we experience of hearing and seeing, and what we see of hearing and seeing. Right? So clearly this is what Allah intends for us to believe. Otherwise, we would not be able to understand what we are being addressed with. Right? So this is the argument. So Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, he's saying that the general thing that they say, Allah has addressed us with language, with speech, that we can understand and grasp. And the Shaykh says, this point here is correct. Yes, it's true, it's correct. Allah has indeed spoken to us with language, in the Arabic language, in the Quran, that which we are clearly able to understand. This bit is correct. And then he mentions ayat from the Quran that clearly indicate this. Allah said in the Quran, "Inna ja'alnahu Qur'anan Arabiyan la'allakum ta'qilun." Indeed, we have made this to be an Arabic Quran in order that you may understand or comprehend. Very clear. Likewise, kitabun anzalnahu ilayka mubarakun liyadabbaru ayatihi wa liyatadhakkara ulul albab. A book which we have sent down to you, it is blessed, in order that they may ponder and reflect its verses, and that those people of intelligence might take an admonition. Tadabbur and tadhakkur. Yes, clear. The Quran is revealed for us to reflect upon it and to take an admonition from it. And similarly, the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِن رَسُولٍ إِلَّا بِلِسَانِ قَوْمِهِ لِيُبَيِّنَ لَهُمْ. We have not sent any messenger except in the language of his people, that he may make it clear to them. So the Shaykh says, وَلَوْلَا أَنَّ اللَّهَ أَرَادَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ أَقْلَ وَفَهْمَ مَا جَاءَتْ بِهِ الرُّسُلُ لكان لسان قومه ولسان غيرهم سواء. So he says, had Allah not wanted from his servants that they understand and they grasp what the messengers have come with, then really there would be no difference between the language of the messenger and the language of the of the people. The language would have really been equal. However, because the Quran is sent in order to establish the proof, then clearly it is meant and intended to be understood and to be grasped, because the Quran establishes the proof upon the creatures. So therefore it must be able to be grasped and understood. So this part of it is correct, right? So the mumathila, when they are saying, we are supposed to understand the Quran, we are supposed to grasp the Quran, this part is definitely true. And the Shaykh, Hafidhahullah, he comments upon these 3 or 4 verses that you've heard, all of these verses that you've heard the Shaykh mention. He has some commentary in his own commentary of this book, and I'll just summarize some of the discussion. The first thing he says is regarding these verses, that if you look at the second verse that we mentioned, Kitabun anzalnahu ilayka mubarakun liyadabbaru ayatih waliyatadhakkar ulul albab. Right? He said, this is a Quran, a book that we have sent to you, blessed, that they may reflect and ponder over its verses, and that they may take an admonition. So the Shaykh explains here, in the first part, the word used was liyadabbaru, right? That they may reflect. This is something that everybody is able to do, a Muslim, non-Muslim, right? This is not unique to certain people. Even a non-Muslim is able to look at the verses of the Quran, to understand what they mean, and to then reflect upon them. Right? This is for everybody. However, the second thing that Allah Azza wa Jal mentioned in that same verse, وَلِيَتَذَكَّرَ أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ, so that the people of intelligence can take or can have tadhakkur. This now is admonition. This now is only for the people of actual intelligence. Right? Because they are the ones who take an admonition. They are the ones who benefit from that. They are the ones who then go on to do what he commanded, keep away from what he prohibited, and actually believe, make tasdeeq of what they are being informed about. Right? So, not everyone who makes tadabbur of the Quran, because the kuffar are able to make tadabbur of the Quran, not all of them are going to take admonition from the Quran. So Allah Azza wa Jal made that distinction between these two things in these actual ayat. And then the Shaykh goes on to mention another, it's like a side point to our discussion. I'll mention it very quickly and very briefly, which is what about those letters which appear at the beginning of certain chapters, alif lam mim, alif lam ra, at the beginning of certain chapters? What does that mean then? And how are we supposed to reflect upon what are their meanings? And so what the Shaykh is summarizing, saying that the most correct opinion about these letters is that these letters in themselves do not really have any, there's no meaning behind these letters. But what they signify is, as explained by Shaykh Islam ibn Taymiyyah, is that these letters are to show to the pagan Arabs that the Quran that you are listening to is made of nothing more than the very letters of the Arabic language that you know and that you use to speak your language. And the Quran is made of only these letters and no other letters. And that's why in all of those chapters of the Quran that begin with Alif Lam Mim, Alif Lam Ra, and Ha Mim, and so on and so forth, Taha, you will see that immediately afterwards, in the next verse, or in the verses that follow, there will always be the mention of the Quran. the Kitab or the Quran, right? So it's to show that these are the letters of which this Quran, is composed of, right? And this is the very language that you speak and that you use. And this Quran is something you are unable to speak the likes of. You are unable to reproduce the likes of this Quran. So indicating that this Quran is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this being like a challenge to the pagan Arabs, that you cannot produce the likes of this Quran with the very letters that you yourself speak. These are no special letters in some other language or in some other tongue or whatever. They are your letters, and you are unable to make the likes of this, you're unable to produce the likes of this Quran. So anyway, Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, he makes that kind of side point there, which is not connected to the actual topic. So after that, we now move to the next part. So in other words, this part is actually correct, right? So the point that we're making here is that what you said is actually correct. The Quran is meant for us to reflect upon, understand, know its meanings, to grasp. All of this is correct and true. However, the next part is where they say, وَأَمَّا قَوْلُهُمْ, as for their statement, إِذَا خَاطَبَنَا عن الغائب بشيء وجب حمله على المعلوم في الشاهد فجوابه من وجهين. Right, so the first part is correct, but then the next principle they add or they use, which is when Allah speaks to us about something which is from the unseen, then it is obligatory to carry that upon what is known from that which is seen. Right? So this is now where they are making the mistake. Right? So when Allah says to us, Allah is As-Sami', Al-Basir, Al-Hayy, the living, the hearing, the seeing, and that Allah has a face and all the various other attributes, they are saying now that because these are things from the unseen, then the only way we can understand them and grasp them and believe in their existence is if we carry them upon what we actually see and observe and experience. And so the Shaykh says the answer to this, there are two answers to this. The first answer, and it actually goes back to the same principles that we mentioned before. He says, أحدهما أنما أخبر الله به عن نفسه إنما أخبر به مضافا إلى نفسه المقدسة فيكون لائقا به لا مماثلا لمخلوقاته. So as for what Allah informed us about himself, then he informed us by ascribing it to his own self. And so therefore it is befitting and unique to himself. It does not resemble the creation. This goes back to the same explanation that we just gave earlier on. If Allah says Allah has life, that life is ascribed specifically to him. Right? And its reality is unique to the reality of the life that we have and living creatures have. If Allah ascribes knowledge to himself, that knowledge, the perfection of its meaning and its reality is unique for Allah. Right? And so again, we go back to the same examples that we said before, that within the creation there is the body, there is the soul, there is the human, there is the jinn. Right? And all of these things have attributes. Right? The soul, when it's outside of the body, it can experience pain and pleasure and it can speak. Right? But how does it do that? We've got no idea. We don't know. Because we don't know what the actual soul, what it's made of. Its essence is different to the essence of a jinn, for example. Right? So once again, when we use words for attributes and we ascribe them to a thing, then the reality of that attribute is unique to that thing. And so we've given clear examples from within the creation. Therefore, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is totally unlike and has no likeness to his creation in the realities of his attributes, that is even more the case. And then he says, وَلَا يُمْكِنْ لِأَحَدٍ أَنْ يَفْهَمَ مِنْهُ الْمُمَاثَلَةِ إِلَّا مَنْ لَمْ يعرف الله تعالى ولم يقدره حق قدره ولم يعرف مدلول الخطاب الذي يقتضيه السياق. So the person who, it's not possible for anyone to understand that there is a likeness between Allah's attributes and those of the creation, except for the one who does not really know Allah and has not really given a just estimation of Allah, and who doesn't really understand speech and the context of the speech, right? So in other words, these people have not really known Allah by way of his revelation, and they haven't made a true estimation of Allah, and they haven't really understood the speech of Allah. So when we say, for example, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ, they haven't understood this speech. They haven't understood what this speech is saying to us. The speech is saying to us that Allah has hearing, Allah has seeing, but there is no likeness between his seeing and his hearing and that of the creatures. This is very clear what these verses are telling us, right? And likewise, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى, to Allah belongs the loftiest example. And likewise, the other verses that we mentioned, فَلَا تَضْرِبُوا لِلَّهِ الْأَمْثَالِ, all these verses are very, very clear and apparent in their meaning. So this is the first response to this to this argument that we can only understand what we can't see by referring it to and carrying it upon what we can see. Right? That's not correct. And the second argument against that, the Shaykh says, الثاني أنه لا يمكن أن تكون المماثلة مرادة لله تعالى. That it is not possible that Allah, when he affirms these things for himself, that he actually wants us to make this likeness. This is impossible for Allah to actually desire that and want that, according to what you are saying. Right? That's what you are saying. You are saying that when Allah says that Allah has hearing and seeing and a life and knowledge and wisdom, and he becomes pleased, he becomes angry, and he has a face, and so on and so forth, you are claiming that Allah wanted us to actually believe that. Right? And however, this essentially is disbelief. Is disbelief, because al-mumathala tastalzimu naqs al-khaliq jalla wa ala. Right? To make a likeness between Allah and his creation, it necessitates ascribing deficiency to Allah as already preceded. And to believe in a deficiency for Allah is disbelief and misguidance. And it is not possible for Allah to want us to believe in what is disbelief and misguidance. Right? Because that's what their argument would amount to. Right? If they say, no, the only way you can believe Allah really exists, and Allah has hearing, and Allah is seeing, and Allah is living, is that he must resemble or be like what we see of life and hearing and seeing and speech, and otherwise we can't believe in him. Right? In essence, what you are really saying is that for us to believe in Allah, we have to reduce him and make him like what we see of the creatures, which is actually disbelief and misguidance. So how can Allah, want us to believe in that which is misguidance? And in fact, the Shaykh mentions two very appropriate verses on this point. And the first verse is that how can this be when Allah himself has said, يُبَيِّنُ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ أَن تَضِلُّوا. This is Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4, verse 176. Allah has made this clear to you, lest you become misguided. Lest you become misguided. Allah would not, make us believe in something which is misguided. And he said, وَلَا يَرْضَى لِعِبَادِهِ الْكُفْرِ. Allah is not pleased with disbelief for his servants. That Surah Zumar, the 39th chapter, verse number 7. Verse number 7. So this kind of brings us to an end of the refutation of the people of Tamthil and the people of Tamthil. And so to kind of summarize the arguments then here, to summarize the whole discussion, this group here, they are the Mumathila, as you can see on the sheet. And the argument is that we can only know the unseen realities to what we see in our experience in the world. So the only way Allah can actually have these attributes is that they must be the same as what we see. Otherwise, there's no other way we can understand the Book of Allah and what He's described to us. This is incorrect. And we mentioned the argument of revelation, the argument of reason, the argument from just pure observation, and the specific mistake that they are making. The Shaykh invalidated that, and this brings us to an end of this group. Now this group, as we said, historically it was the minority. They weren't very large in number, and then they basically disappeared and dwindled because the Rafida, the Shia, who were upon this Tamthil, they actually left it and they went into the belief of the Mu'tazila, which is to basically reject and to deny the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this now leads us to the next section or the next chapter in the book. And so here, this is where we make a start in looking at the other group, right? Which is the group who negate the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in the next section, Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah, he says, Fasal, chapter, وَالْقِسْمُ الثَّانِي, the second group of people, they are the Mu'attila, meaning those who negate and who divest and who strip Allah of His attributes. They remove the attributes of Allah. وَهُمُ الَّذِينَ أَنْكَرُوا مَا سَمَّ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى وَوَصَفَ بِهِ نَفْسَهُ إِنْكَارًا كُلِّيًّا أَوْ جُزْئِيًّا. Right, so these are the ones who they reject what Allah named Himself and described Himself with. So whatever Allah named Himself with and described Himself with, this group as a whole, they either reject it altogether or they reject a part of it. They reject it all of it, or they reject a part of it. وَحَرَّفُوا مِنْ أَجْلِ ذَلِكَ نُصُوصَ الْكِتَابِ وَالسُّنَّةِ. And then they distorted the texts of the book and the sunnah. فَهُمْ مُحَرِّفُونَ لِلنُّصُوصِ مُعَطِّلُونَ لِلصِّفَاتِ. So these people, they are those who distort the texts and they negate the attributes. وَقَدْ انْقَسَمَ هَؤُلَاءِ إِلَىٰ أَرْبَعِ طَوَائِفِ. And this group is divided into 4 further divisions or 4 further groups. Right? So this is the introduction to the Mu'attila, and what we want to do before we go any further, what we want to do is we want to make sure that from this point onwards we really grasp in our minds what first of all who these groups are. And so if you look on the actual diagram, you can see that on the side of the Mu'attila there are 4 groups, or there are 5 groups I've mentioned actually. The philosophers, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, and the Ash'ariyah. Right? And in between there is a group known as the Kullabiyah. The Kullabiyah. Now the 4 groups which are mentioned here in the book, the 4 groups are going to be the philosophers, the Mutafalsifa, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, and the Ash'ariyah at the end. And that group in the middle, the Kullabiyah, they are like, you can call them a bridge. They're like a bridge between the Mu'tazila and those who came after the Ash'ariyah. Right? So, now, like I said, before we go any further, and to understand what is going to come in the book, it's important that we understand why did these people deny the attributes of Allah? What's leading them to deny the attributes of Allah, either completely or in part? Right? So this is what we are going to, inshallah, discuss. Before we continue any further, we're going to basically speak about this, inshallah ta'ala, and try to make sure we understand the reason why this is. And to discuss this, we have to discuss numerous kind of issues, right? So the first issue is that that which we know from the texts of the Quran and the Sunnah is that knowledge of Allah and belief in Allah and belief that there is a creator, it is something innate. It is something what we call fitri and daruri, right? And it is something that Allah puts in every single newborn. There are many things, even from a physical point of view, you know from experience, that as soon as a newborn is born, and if the mother takes that newborn and puts it next to her breast, there's an automatic reflex that the newborn already knows. It already knows. And then it goes to the breast, to suckle on the breast. No one had to teach it that. It didn't have to be taught that. It's upon delivery, it knows exactly what to do. Right? So this is like physically, this is something that the child already knows. But then there's also other things that the child, if left, it knows innately and intuitively that there is a creator and that there is a maker. Right? And this is something that even many researchers, many non-Muslim researchers, they've done research on children, like infants, and looked at how they respond to things and actions that they do and the underlying assumptions behind those actions. And what they say is that all children, like they understand that there has to be like a design and purpose in things, and they are inclined towards belief in a creator. Right, so and this is something that the Quran has told us, and what the Messenger has told us, right? مَا مِن مَوْلُودٍ إِلَّا يُولَدُ عَلَى الْفِطْرَةِ. There is no child except that it is born upon the fitrah. So, we as people of the Sunnah, if you look on the other side, right? So what I'm explaining to you now, I'm explaining to you the middle column, right? The middle column on the other side of this diagram is Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah, right? This is how we start in speaking about Allah's existence and His Tawheed, right? So in other words, are people born with a blank slate, or are people born with an innate, intuitive belief and knowledge that doesn't require reflection that there is a maker and a creator? Which of the two is it? Which of the two is it? The second one, right? Why? Because we know from the Quran and the Sunnah, we've been told textually that this is the case. And secondly, even though we don't need to rely upon that, but even from experience and from the research, they tell us the same thing as well. That is basically hardwired into the very being of a human to recognize innately that there's meaning, purpose, design in things which point to the only possibility being that it's an actual it's a creator. All right. So this is where we start here. Is that very clear? Okay. This is very different to the people of philosophy, people of kalam, and people like that, right? They start on the premise that no, we are born upon an absolute clean slate. There's nothing inherent, there's nothing innate. You are not born to recognize a creator. You're not born with, this kind of original disposition. It's absolutely, completely clean slate. Right. Now, let me ask you a question. Depending on which of these two premises you start off from, then what will you make to be the most important? What will you interpret to be the foundation of Islam? Do you understand the question now? If you start on this premise that there's the fitrah, right? You already recognize and know that there's a creator. What's the first obligation then? What's the first thing that you will make to be the foundation of Islam? What will it be? It will be to worship the creator. Yes or no? Right? It will be yes. It will be to single out Allah in worship. To believe in Allah and to single out Allah in worship. Yes, if you start off on this premise, right? Which is what the Quran is telling us. Right. But if you start here, right, what is the first thing you are now going to make to be the foundation of Islam? Huh? Yes. You're going to make the first thing to be to prove Allah's existence. You're going to make that to be the foundation of Islam. Right? To prove the existence of Allah. Right? To prove that He exists. You are now going to make this to be the essence of Islam, the foundation of Islam upon which everything else in Islam rests upon. Right? So, what I'm showing to you, I'm going to take it, inshallah, step by step to show you the mistakes that are being made by the people of Kalam, who are these, and the people of philosophy, right, in how they acquire their speech or their creed about the Creator, and how they speak about the Creator, and why they speak the way they do. Right? So in a step-by-step fashion, we're going to try, inshallah, to show all the mistakes that are being made at every point, to show how they are misguided and why they are led to deny the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the first important thing to understand here, it really comes back down to this issue, right? That we know that every child is born upon fitrah. It has an innate recognition that there is a maker and a creator, and if left alone like that, it will be naturally inclined to Islam. Islam meaning to worship Allah, to be grateful to Allah, and if there's no other influence upon the child, it will go in that direction, right? And so we don't need to teach it any kind of philosophical arguments or even rational arguments to put the belief in Allah into that child as it develops, because it's already innate and intuitive. It knows that already, right? All we need to do is to instruct the child how to worship Allah and how to be grateful to Allah, right? So if we start on that premise, then obviously what we make to be the foundation of the religion, and what we even explain the kalima to mean, la ilaha illallah, it will affect that, right? But if we start over here upon the premise that there's a clean slate and there's absolutely nothing, and so therefore, in order for the child to have faith, to have iman, it has to know intellectual and rational proofs for the existence of Allah. Okay, now we're not denying that there aren't, there are rational and intellectual proofs for Allah's existence, right? However, these people over here, right, which are going to be the Mu'attila, what they do is that the actual arguments and the actual rational proofs they are going to use to prove Allah's existence, they are going to be taken from the misguided nations. right? From the philosophers, the Greek philosophers, from the Sabi'ah, from the Yahud, from the Nasara, they're going to take that philosophical confusion and whatever, and they're going to use it to devise certain evidences for Allah's existence, which are going to land them in trouble. And inshallah, we're going to look at that in the next lesson. Right? So the first thing to be very clear about, the difference between the people of Tawheed, people of Sunnah, is that we start off, right, that proving Allah's existence is not actually the foundation of Islam, because Allah's existence is fitri, it is daruri, right? It is the most obvious thing. You don't need any philosophical proof to know that something is originated, right? I just know from observation that you as a human, you are originated. You weren't there in 19 whatever it might be, 1990, 1992, 90 whatever it might be, and then lo and behold, in 1993 you were there. You weren't there, and then you were there. So you are originated. I don't need any deep philosophical proof about bodies and their attributes and this and whatever, and I just know from observation that things are actually originated. They come to be and then they are not, and they are not and then they come to be. We know from observation, right? So we know that just by observation there is a maker, there's a creator. We know by fitra as well. And yes, there are rational arguments. There are sound rational arguments. But what these people did over here is they used flawed arguments by relying upon the terminology and the language of the philosophers, and they became entangled in all of that, right? And then they went into, it led them to misguidance. So we're going to look at that process, inshallah, before we continue any further in this book, because to grasp that really is very, very important. Otherwise you won't really understand, what each group is saying and why are they saying it, and the arguments against them. So it's important that we do that first, inshallah, before we continue in the with the rest of the book. So inshallah we'll stop there at this point, and inshallah we'll continue. Okay, so there won't be a lesson next week, and there may not be a lesson I think the week after either, because of travels, inshallah. So either way, if you keep a check on the groups, it'll be announced inshallah either way. So we'll take up the discussion in the next lesson, whenever that is, inshallah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.